Youngsters from Liverpool, England.
Hello, I'm Jack, and you're listening to the Here, There, and Everywhere podcast, an interview show about the Beatles' influence in the past, present, and future across the universe and across generations. Today we have a very special guest on the show, one of my personal heroes, Dr. Carolyn Porco. Carolyn is a planetary scientist who is renowned for her imaging work on NASA's Voyager mission to Uranus and Neptune in the 1980s, and for her leadership of the imaging science team on the 27-year-long Cassini mission to Saturn. It's likely that every picture you've ever seen of Saturn is due to her incredible work. In fact, Neil deGrasse Tyson calls her Madam Saturn. Carolyn was responsible for two very famous images of planet Earth. You may not know this, but she was a co-originator, along with Carl Sagan, of the pale blue dot image of Earth, taken in 1990 from the Voyager spacecraft. And she was responsible for the image and global event from 2013 called The Day the Earth Smiled. Look that up on the web if you've never heard of it. It's awesome. Carolyn has delivered multiple TED presentations of her work in planetary exploration and the beauty of life on our planet and our responsibility to preserve it. She's also the recipient of many prestigious awards, such as the American Astronomical Society's Carl Sagan Medal for Excellence in the Communication of Science to the Public, and the Distinguished Alumni Award from her alma mater, the California Institute of Technology. In 2012, she was named one of Time magazine's 25 most influential people in space. She grew up in the 1950s and 60s, decades that will always be remembered for introducing two extraordinary phenomena to the world: the space race, and the Beatles. From an early age, Carolyn began her lifelong interest in space, as well as her lifelong fascination with the Beatles. She's been such a huge, die-hard admirer of the Beatles that she once led the Cassini imaging team across Abbey Road dressed as the Beatles. There's a photo to prove this on our website, along with a transcript of this entire podcast. And she has dedicated her imaging work to the Beatles on numerous occasions. She's also a friend of Sean Lennon. You'll be able to find links to our website, to Carolyn's Twitter, and to everything discussed in this podcast in the podcast description. Carolyn, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Well, thank you for having me, Jack.
How are you doing?
Happy birthday.
Thank you so much.
I'm doing great. I really am. I'm doing really well.
Carolyn, can we start from the beginning, and can you tell us a little bit about how you grew up?
Well, I grew up in the Bronx. I was born in 1953, so, my early life was the 1950s, and the 1950s were a pretty optimistic period. The late 1950s came along, and we were challenged by the launch of Sputnik, and there was a Cold War going on, but people were pretty much economically doing well. You must have heard that post-war America did pretty well. And my parents were immigrants. They had come in the early 20th century when they were much younger. They met in New York City. It was, we were pretty comfortable. We were lower middle class, and money was always an issue, but there wasn't the great inequalities there were now, and there were opportunities out there. So overall, things were pretty comfortable.
Was there anything or anyone in particular that convinced you to, or motivated you to pursue a life dedicated to studying planets and outer space?
NASA was established in 1958. So that's on the heels of the launch of Sputnik. So 1958, I was 5 years old. So I really feel like my life paralleled that of NASA. I am a child of the space program in a sense. And my early life, when I'm learning how to read and so on, I remember opening up my father's newspapers and seeing, pictures from the moon or pictures from Venus or Mars. These grainy old pictures with the Rousseau dots, the very first images from planets and the moon and so on. And then President Kennedy says in 1961 and 62, makes it clear we are going to the moon. And I think that proclamation really set the tone for what followed. It set the tone for that kind of off the leash, push the envelope and any direction you can behavior that characterized the 60s, right? Because this was a president telling his people that we are going to set our sights on doing something that for all of human history had been emblematic of the impossible. And he's telling us, we Americans have what it takes to do it. We have the intelligence, we have the technological know-how, we have the grit, we have, everything it takes. We can marshal together and do this. So I think that, talk about optimism, I think, and then watching the space program unfold with the Gemini missions and so on, really I grew up in that era, and many of us who grew up in that era, not surprisingly, were drawn into the space program. It was that kind of thrill and excitement and optimism.
How did you hear the Beatles for the first time?
For Christmas of 1963, so I'm 10. I'm a few months away from being 11. I think one of my brothers gave me my first transistor radio. This is like ancient history for you, a little square transistor radio about, 2.5 inches on the side, maybe 3 inches on a side, maybe about 1/2 inch thick. And that was it. That was my radio. And the next day, December 26, 1963, the Beatles released I Want to Hold Your Hand. And I think I read somewhere that some DJs had gotten a copy of it and they were already airing it in the United States, but I didn't have a means to tune in then because I didn't have my radio. But I got my radio for Christmas, and it's almost as if I flipped it on and there was I Want to Hold Your Hand, almost. So that was it. That was my introduction.
Wow. So what were your first thoughts when you heard them?
Like everybody then, I was just captivated by the music. It was so much better to me. Immediately, I could tell. It was so much more energetic, more rich, more multidimensional than, not only in the music itself, but eventually in the context, the content and what they were writing about. Then the music that my brothers had been listening to, like Elvis Presley and all that 1950s rock and roll. So, this swept across, that's what Beatlemania was. The younger generation really glommed onto this. So I was no different. And then, of course, we learned that they're going to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show. And they were going to come to America. And this is something that it's hard to describe. And I haven't seen a lot has been written about the Beatles. I haven't seen a lot written about this, but there was a lot of advance advertisement for their coming to the United States. His DJ name was Cousin Brucey. And then there was the second DJ called Murray the K. Murray the K and Cousin Brucey. And these guys made a big deal about the Beatles coming. So much so, Jack, that when the Beatles got on their airplane to fly across the Atlantic to arrive here in America, it was like the invasion of Normandy. They were, the disc jockeys were saying, and now the Beatles are 5 Beatle hours away from arriving on the shores of America. They're almost here. And, America is just waiting for this phenomenon from Europe, blah, blah, blah. And then it would be, and ladies and gentlemen, it's only 3 Beatle hours and they will be here. That's what it was like. It's like they just generated so much excitement about their arrival. And then when they arrived, you've seen, of course, all the pictures. They were shocked that they had such a greeting party. They didn't expect it. This was these exotic individuals coming all the way from England. And then they appear on the Ed Sullivan Show and they've got this, hair that no one had ever seen before. And their accents, and they were dressed beautifully, by the way. Brian Epstein did a magnificent job packaging them, because you go back and look, they look immaculate, they look fresh and clean. And then, of course, there's the great Beatle bow. They just had such class. We fell in love with them. And then the icing on the cake was only a few months later, in the summer of '64, they put out Hard Day's Night. And that's when we really fell in love with them, because then you could see them, follow them, and witness their interactions. And so A Hard Day's Night is really what made all of us become absolutely smitten with them, because that's when you could see their distinct personalities and how just absolutely natural and casual and easygoing and the British would say cheeky and irreverent they were, and just having a great time. And they were young, and like nothing affected them in a bad way. They just were themselves. It was really, and then we got to see them play their music. It was great. And you've seen that movie, of course. Roger Ebert, a well-known film critic, American film critic, called Hard Day's Night one of the great life-affirming movies of all time. It
Wow.
was so well done. It influenced movies since then. This was wholly different. And so that's really what sealed it.
Did they influence your life in any way aside from just music taste?
They made life so much nicer. They just make you happy, right? Everything about them makes you happy. If you turn and listen to an interview and you see how funny they can be, just naturally funny and witty, and they were so distinct, each of them was so distinct that, they just created, in a field of mathematics called nonlinear dynamics, there's something called a complex adaptive system, which is, you have individual components, and the interactions of these components is like almost unpredictable from knowing the individual systems, of themselves. You know what I'm saying? Like you could predict the individual systems. You can't predict what happens when they all interact together. And that's kind of what the Beatles were. They were this giant phenomenon that was like a complex adaptive system. And their tentacles went everywhere because they were just so curious and intelligent.
Carolyn, what do you think it is about the Beatles that makes them so much more than just a band?
If I had to put my finger on why the Beatles were so phenomenal in the true meaning of that word, it's because they were intelligent. They were college educated for the most part, and they made music for thinking people. Really, that's it. They made music for people who wanted to be not only musically stimulated, but they wanted to be intellectually stimulated. It gave us something to think about. And every single song was different than the one before. We watched them evolve. They were open to influences from the outside, and that was a byproduct of their intelligence, and the fact that they were, the three of them, John, Paul, and George, they all had an artistic bent. So, and then I could go on and on about, how talented Paul was musically. Probably musically, he was the most talented of them. John was like off the charts with, wit and his use of words, his facility with words and concepts, and just, they were just amazing. I feel like I was so incredibly lucky to have been born when I was born, because like I said, I grew up with the space program, and ultimately I lived my life doing that. And then there was, alongside that, there was this phenomenal, blossoming of art and music and so on, primarily because of the Beatles.
Can you tell us about the ways in which you've honored the Beatles through your work?
Of course, because I love them so much, and because I lived through that era and was so happy and grateful that I did live through that era. They set new standards of excellence, and I wanted to honor them with what I did with Cassini. So as I told you, I celebrated Paul's 64th birthday by making a movie with 64 Saturn images, and I put it to Beatles music. It was really a labor of love. It took a lot of time. I did this with a person who was working in my shop called Chris Clark. He was a whiz with software. I was the director, he was the implementer, and we did such a careful job of, doing the soundtrack to sync up with what we were doing with the images. And then we made this poster. I designed this poster that has all the 64 images, and I have an inscription to Paul, and I signed it, my name and the Cassini imaging team, and I meant to send it to him. I had it mounted. It was very expensive, hundreds of dollars to get it mounted, this big thing. By the time I got ready to send it to him, which actually is embarrassing, but it was like a few years later because I was so busy. By the time I got ready to send it to him, he had sent word out that he was no longer accepting presents from the public because he had like a warehouse full of presents. So I still have this poster. I mean, the thing that, I mounted, and I'm going to soon be making this poster available. Like if people want it, I'll make copies. But anyway, that's what I did for Paul. And then even before I did that, I celebrated John's 60th birthday, October 9, 2000, by releasing on that day our first color image of Jupiter. It was our first color image ever. We got to Jupiter. We started our encounter with Jupiter. I just managed to arrange it so that we released it on his birthday. That took a little bit of political persuasion on my part of the powers that be. And that was my happy birthday present to John. So, I've been searching for all these opportunities to do things like that. Because they just, again, they just mean so much to me.
Can you tell us a story of how the Cassini imaging team came to be reenacting the famous Abbey Road crosswalk photo? I have a feeling it has something to do with your influence.
I'm very proud of this. See, this is how you've become quite astute at being a leader of people, because I managed to convince 6 grown men to follow me in costume across Abbey Road, and we had someone take a picture of it. And I'm very proud because the internet isn't that old. And we took this picture in the year 2001. So that's already like 20 years ago. Our picture was the first picture to be uploaded on Wikipedia under the entry Abbey Road, the road. It was the first picture, and for a while, the only picture that was there as an example that every minute out of every day, people are doing this. And I was so deeply proud. It's also on my Cyclops website. You can put all the links to these things in the podcast description.
So how did you come to meet Sean Lennon?
So I met Sean Lennon on Twitter.
No
way. The same way I met you, yeah. I found out that he was on Twitter, so I started following him. And then I noticed he was interested in science. And he was commenting on science, and he wrote some tweet about something, some great picture. And I just wrote to him and said, boy, if you think that picture's cool, you should see our Cassini pictures. And I might have even put a picture in the tweet, and he wrote back. And it immediately took off. Like, he was very interested in what I had to say. I was starting to be, for Star Talk, Neil deGrasse Tyson's Star Talk. Mm-hmm. I was one of what they call an all-star host. They tried this concept where they had other people who were Star Talk hosts. I guess maybe to relieve Neil from having to, do it all the time. And I was one of them. And the idea was that I would interview people. And I asked Sean if he could be my first interview. But not my first. I don't know if he was my first, but he was an interview. So I interviewed him. I remember going to a concert of his in Oakland, California. I was living in the Bay Area. That's where I met his mom. I showed you the picture of that. Yes. I had met her in the 1970s, actually, when she was much younger and I was much younger, just briefly, but then I met her again. That was great. Anyway, so we stayed in touch. I invited him to a SpaceX launch at Cape Canaveral. And I arranged it so that he got a tour with his lady friend, Charlotte, and he got a tour of, the Space Center and, what goes on down there and Cape Canaveral and all the rockets and so on. I have to say, because this really meant a lot to me, we were there, coincidentally, again, we were there on the 50th anniversary of the release of Sgt. Pepper. So that was pretty cool for me to be there with Sean on such a a momentous anniversary. Just shows you I lead a charmed existence, because these kinds of things happen to me all the time. So then we had planned always to do something. We talked a lot about it, doing something creative together, like doing a video using Cassini imagery with some story. He was going to do the music for it. But this is all by way of saying Sean and I kind of did this for a couple years. And then I got really busy with the end of Cassini and what I had to do after the project was over to wrap things down, close out my contract. And Sean got really busy doing an album with his collaborator. And so, that kind of, we lost touch a bit. And now he's very, very, very busy. He's, as I've read, he's in charge now. Yoko has handed to him responsibility for the Lennon estate. He's directing something like 8 companies. I don't know. It sounds wild to me.
Wow, really?
Yeah, that's what it says. It says on the internet, you could find it. So anyway, that's how I met him. And we got pretty close. We just have not had the opportunity really to hang out anymore. I've been in touch with him recently. A special event was about to happen. I can't tell you what it is because it's been postponed. It may yet happen, but so we may do that in the future. But anyway, he's cool. He's a very interesting character, very cosmopolitan.
And Carolyn, I know you've been to Liverpool a couple of times. Can you tell us about your visits there?
So, I mean, this shows you how obsessed I was. I've been about the Beatles. My first opportunity to go to Europe came in 1981 when I was still in graduate school, and there was a professional meeting in the south of France about the study of rings, which was what I did my doctorate on. And so I went there, funded by my thesis advisor, and first time I went to Europe, and I went to the meeting, so on, but right after that meeting, I went to England, and I landed in London. And instead of doing what you think someone might do, landing in London and touring around London, I made a beeline for Liverpool. I had to go to Liverpool. And for me, remember, this is like, I think the summer of 81, John had died half a year earlier. So many of us were just absolutely stunned and grief-stricken and just like almost walking around dazed. And I think that brought a lot of us who had lived through the 60s together, like we're calling each other up. I remember my older brother and I getting on the phone, even I hadn't spoken to him in years. And suddenly it's just, the kind of thing you might do when you're commiserating with someone, like, can you believe this happened? And what a horror, and oh my God, this, and oh my God, that. And so it just brought the Beatles into my on my radar screen again. I wanted to go to Liverpool. It was a research project for me. I wanted to find out what was it about Liverpool and that area that made these 4 individuals what they were as individuals, and then what they became as a group. My mathematical mind is saying to me, it can't just be that it's a coincidence that these 4 supremely talented people happen to come from the same place and happen to meet up. Everybody up there they are really a product of their environments. Everybody up there is very humorous and witty and, quick with a reply. And, they're all so charming up there. That's their shtick up there. They are absolutely lovely. And teasing, oh man, I got to know some people. I came to know people in the Lake District, not exactly Liverpool area, but close enough. It's Northern England. And they really tease, so you could see where Lennon and all those guys, when they're teasing each other, where they got it from. And they tease to the point of, sometimes I was left, when my friends would tease me, I'd be left thinking, oh my God, they don't really like me, do they?
Right.
Really, that's how it was. But that's how they show it, that they really do like you. They just tease the hell out of you. In their language, it's called taking the piss. And I think it's a very musical place because, as the history books have even said. It was a port city, and records were coming into Liverpool that apparently never even made it to London, I guess. So I remember one of the Beatles saying, we got music that people in London weren't even hearing. So anyway, they were a product of their environment. And of course, on top of that, they were supremely talented and dedicated to it. And that was, of course, of their own. So maybe there was some luck in it. I know Paul has often said, he said, people ask me if I believe in magic. I have to believe in magic. Just me getting together with John, like the most successful songwriting collaboration in all of history. So that, they own that. But the area is just filled with charming people, and it's really delightful. Have you ever been there?
I've actually never been there.
Well, go. Just don't wait a minute after this podcast is over. You should get on an airplane and go.
I'll buy a ticket right now.
It's great. It was really lovely. Of course, I went there. This was, oh my God, I can't even think about it. The first time I went was 40 years ago. Wow. How could that be? How could that be?
Well, yeah, you got to go back over there.
I'm definitely going to go back there. Yeah, especially after this documentary has got me all, interested again in their history.
You mentioned the Get Back documentary. I would love to hear your thoughts about it.
Well, a lot has been written about it. People are commenting all over the place, and a lot of what people say I agree with. It just was like a stunning window into all the things I described about them, their individual personalities, their interactions, and the insights you get into just how close they must have been, and how easily things just came, musical things and lyrics and so on just came to them, and their whole process. The way they made music was actually so non-linear and chaotic that you wouldn't, me trying to be a very linear person, being a scientist, you move from this is in a logical fashion, you move from that, you move to that, right? They didn't do it in a logical fashion, and it just worked beautifully for them. And then, of course, to see Paul, the moment that everyone has written about, to see Paul almost work himself into a trance and strum and sing to life. You see, Get Back. And he's like just forcing himself to do it. It really felt to me like he's trying to put himself in the zone, trying to get into a trance where the song just naturally comes. And by God, it did. It was just a stunning moment. Really, really very eye-opening. I learned a lot about they as individuals. And so I'll start with Paul. Paul was clearly the heart of the Beatles. I mean, by that I mean, I think he was the one that was the most good-natured. I really think when we hear all those things that are so wholesome about the Beatles' music, I think it comes from him, because that's who he was. He even said he was brought up in a very loving family. People didn't say nasty things to one another. He describes, as a Boy Scout, he'd go and visit an old lady or two in the neighborhood and just sit and chat with them to see how they were. And he'd go buy groceries for them and things like that. He didn't say this in the documentary. I've read this elsewhere. He was so committed to his buddies, the Beatles, each of them, so giving of himself. Really, I mean, if I had to choose one of them for a friend, it would be Paul. Paul would be your loyal friend. He was the guy driven. He was driven. He had the work ethic, and it showed in what they did. I wouldn't be surprised if he was always the one saying to John, we got to finish this song. So, and then I have to say another insight into Paul. I mean, the poor guy, John, who had been the de facto leader early on, was kind of absent, right? You could see that. He's checking out. He's kind of taking a back seat. He's not driving the bus. He doesn't want to drive the bus anymore. So Paul has to move into this role. It's a role, I can tell you, being the leader from experience, being the leader is not necessarily being the most liked person, because you're the one who's got to crack the whip on people. And here he is trying to herd cats, right? Trying to get everybody going. And he gives, in one place, he gives this fabulous inspirational little speech where he says, if there was ever anything good about us, it's we've got our back against the wall, and we managed to pull out of it. And I watched him through all this documentary, and I thought to myself, they could make a primer on leadership based on his behavior in this documentary. Next, I go to John, and it was so eye-opening to witness John in action with his fellow Beatles, not as a person being sat in a chair with a microphone in his face being interviewed, which is the only other channel through which I ever got anything about John, right? That was all there was. You watch him perform, and then you watch him being interviewed. And in those two places, he always looks so strong and confident and dominant, quick with the word, quick with the witticism, always had something to say, always looked very assertive, right? And I see him finally in this documentary, and he looks fragile. He looks fragile, he looks insecure. I mean, there were so many scenes. Do you remember the scene when Paul comes up to him, very dominant, like, so have you written any songs yet, John?
Oh, yeah.
And all John can say is he takes, like, affectionately kind of punches Paul and says, nope, I have nothing. As if, like, I don't know, maybe this was his stab at being dominant in some way to kind of punch him lightly. But basically, it was his sheepish way of admitting, no, I don't have anything. And just various places where he's, one place where he says, oh, I don't like my voice. He never liked his voice, but he says, my voice is rotten. I wish I had yesterday's voice with today's backing. My voice didn't sound good. He's just not the confident person he projected. Despite what people saw presented in the Beatles, he was actually very vulnerable and very weak, for all the reasons that we know now, because he had a very troubled childhood. So that was a great eye-opener to me. I feel like I finally got to know what John was like through this documentary. And then, of course, there was George, and you can't help but feel sympathetic towards George. Look at the situation he was in. He comes in as the youngest of all of them. When they started, they were just teenagers. So that means a lot when you're a teenager, right? And also, he hadn't even fully grown yet. So John and Paul were, of course, looking at him as just the sidekick. And I don't think, you know how these things go. Once a relationship gets set, it's hard to change it, especially when they're family, when they're very close relationships. So I think that was George's, situational tragedy, that he could never really stand astride John and Paul because they wouldn't let him do it. Just innately, they always looked down on him, not down in the sense that you're no good, but down in the sense that you're not up to our level. You don't have the same say in the choice of songs. So, and you could just see him pushing up against this and running into it. And it just was painful, especially knowing what he produced. I mean, there's a scene where he says to John, I've got like 3 albums worth of songs that are backed up to do. I'd like to do my own album. And John thankfully says, oh, that would be nice. Yeah, that'd be good. You should do that. So that was kind of a bone thrown to George. But you can't help but feel sympathetic for him because he's so gentle. He's just such a gentle soul. And so kind to Ringo. Remember, he's teaching Ringo how to work his song. And then we come to Ringo, and I didn't ever think much of Ringo. Not that I disliked him at all, but I just, never appreciated the drums, And then in here, you get to see what an impossibly lovely guy he was. So friendly and cheerful when it was required, and just always like being the loyal friend and just the lovely guy. But like the support wagon, the guy who's always there to support them all. it didn't matter. One video on the web said this. It didn't matter how many takes they, had to go through where they wanted. He's always there, doing his drumming. And then, of course, I've heard since in the videos that are on the web about this documentary that, he would endure many, many, many takes. He'd just get there, always drumming his drum, never complaining. Oh my God, this is the 102nd take. He would just do it. Just a good-natured person, and actually beautiful in a way. I never appreciated that. He's got these beautiful. You may not, as a guy, appreciate this, but he's got these beautiful big eyes, lovely, lovely smile. I mean, really, I just have now great love for Ringo. I really do. We did have the impression from the 1970s Let It Be documentary that, they were just at each other's throats. But knowing that they were not, and that largely it was very collaborative and joyous and happy and fun, and they were like in their 20s and still having a high old time, that has felt so good to know. And then, of course, knowing that after the Get Back album and the concert was done, I don't know, a month or two later, they're back in the studio and they're doing Abbey Road, which was one of their best albums. And they went out on an amazing high note. I mean, really, and one thing I want to say here, I don't know if anyone else has ever said anything about this, but this has got nothing to do, well, I'll say it, it's okay, because it's got nothing to do with Get Back. It's got to do with Abbey Road. It was stunningly great, and also really, to me, regretful that the one and only jam that the Beatles ever recorded was the second side of Abbey Road, where the three guitarists are just going back and forth. And I thought that was, even when I was whatever I was, like 16, even then I thought, my God, this is so spectacular. Why did they never do this before? Because I mean, how do you feel about it? That jam,
I thought it was their best musical moment ever. I was always obsessed with that moment. I'm a huge fan of the Allman Brothers and the Grateful Dead and different jam bands, and the Beatles can really jam too. And I wish they got more credit for that. George Martin said it was as if they were in their Hamburg days again. They were just standing around in a circle, just smiling and playing guitars with each other.
Yeah, because I mean, they probably planned it, I guess. I don't know if they wrote the notes down and they did it, but it really felt very organic, like they were speaking to each other, but only with their guitars. And God, they could have done that for an hour and I would have listened to that. So it was just a shame there wasn't more of that. So anyway, they were just so phenomenally good.
So where do you think the Beatles are going to be 50, 100 years from now? Or do you think they're still going to be this popular?
Well, I just want to remind you and your listeners that for just about every circumstance in one's life that you can think of, there is a song title or there is a Beatles phrase in a song that fits. It's like hand in glove, and this, I think, I don't know, maybe I'm overreaching here, but I attribute this to Paul, because Paul was really the storyteller. He was the one who loved to celebrate the everyday and the ordinary and speak about just, Eleanor Rigby, Father Mackenzie, Desmond and Molly, and he was the guy most often, I think, who brought in these characters, and he would paint vignettes and so on. They created a universe, really, in their catalog. There is a universe that you can go into and live and just get to know these characters and all these events that happen. And so I think that's why, and I think Paul was largely responsible for it. And I think that's why you can find something appropriate for, every kind of feeling or emotion you might have. And so in that respect, they were like modern day Shakespeare's. Shakespeare wrote plays for the everyday person. And that's why he was popular and why his stuff has endured. And I think the Beatles stuff will endure. I mean, look, it's endured for 52 years, for God's sakes, and more, of course, if you go back all the way to the beginning. It's stunning to me. I can't even get my head around it. You're much, much younger than me, but I lived back there. It's stunning to me to realize that already over a half century has happened, right? And we're still talking about them, and there's young people like you've discovered them. So, excuse me for saying, there's nothing so special about your generation in discovering them, because generations between yours and mine discovered them. So I think they will endure, like Mozart, like Beethoven, like Shakespeare. This was an enduring catalog that happened to be created at a time when, well, just happened to be created in the middle of the 20th century. And I don't think we're going to see anything in the musical arena that's going to be like it ever again.
When you listen to the Beatles' music, do you get a similar feeling as when you look through a telescope at Saturn or Jupiter?
It makes me happy. It makes me happy. And I guess in that sense, yeah, it makes me, when I look through a telescope, or I just go outside and I look up at the stars at night, and I realize where we live, how precious our lives are, how lucky each of us was to be born. I mean, the improbability of any one of us being here is so off the charts, infinitesimal, that when you really are confronted with that and you take the time to dwell on it, you can't help but just be, wow, really. And especially when you look at the universe and you see how small we are, how grand it is, but yet how powerful it is that we have come to know that, our intellect has allowed us to grasp what our cosmic circumstances are. That is a reason not for feeling small and scared. It's a reason for feeling exalted and grateful that we know so much. I mean, really, that's how I feel about my life. I feel like, wow, I got to live. If you want perspective on your life, just go out on a starry night and look up and think about what you're looking at. Look at the Milky Way. Think about what you're looking at. You're looking at the edge of a gigantic disk of stars that is your home. That galaxy is your home. And so I feel exalted and grateful when I look through a telescope to see Saturn, or I go out and look at the stars, and I feel, it's true, I do. I feel exactly the same way. When I listen to the Beatles, I feel, I can't believe I was born when I was born, and then I got a transistor radio the day that I Want to Hold Your Hand was released. I turned it on, and there's that song, and that was my intro into this universe that ended up being created over the next 6 years. So it's all about being grateful. I'm grateful and happy.
I love that. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Carolyn. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you very much for having me and doing this. It's been fun.